They built white picket fences to look like the American dream, but inside were dinners where only one child got the best piece of chicken. I wasn't scolded. I wasn't hit. I was forgotten. And you know what? Forgetting makes a sound. It's not silent. It's the sound of your heart exploding in your chest while no one notices. I was born in the suburbs just outside Atlanta, where lawns were trimmed like scripts, and my family looked like the pilot episode of a wholesome show until the camera stopped rolling. We had all the ingredients of stability: a history teacher dad, a mother who sold houses and aspirations, and a sister who was polished like a showroom trophy. And me, I was the outline in the background, the one who gave shape to the story but never got a scene of her own. My father, Marcus, was the only one who saw me outside of expectation. He used to say, "You're a storyteller born in blood. Nobody had to teach you." On quiet nights, he'd sit with me under the desk lamp, watching me draw like each line was a reason I deserved to be here. But those moments were brief. He died on a crisp fall morning when I was 13. His heart gave out without warning, just like his hugs. Sudden, sure, and gone too soon. At his funeral, Candace stood in the crook of our mother's arm. I stood off to the side, clutching his favorite tie, the one he wore to my parent-teacher nights. My mother didn't cry, not because she was strong, but because her heart only broke for one child. After he died, the roles were assigned. Candace became the princess in need of protection. I became the strong one, which is just another way of saying the one we don't have to love out loud. My mother called me independent, but really, she was just too busy loving someone else. Candace had a barely passing GPA, but was sweet and had marriage potential. I won the state art prize. My mother said, "That's nice, but can you make a living off drawing?" I found refuge in books, in watercolor palettes, in lunch periods spent alone in the school library, scribbling poems like lifelines. I lived in hidden revenge, not through screaming, but by surviving loudly in a house that tried to mute me. When I got a full scholarship to study art in New York, my mother sighed. Candace also wanted to study far away, except she never applied. I got it. In our home, my dreams didn't have the right to exist. So I packed my things, my father's photo, and a brown leather journal where I wrote family tales no one ever cared to hear. You asked me if I was angry. Of course, but not the kind of revenge stories you're thinking of. Not the ones where pain gets paid forward. This was different. This was reclaiming my life from hands that never held it gently. It was the cheating story where betrayal didn't come from a lover, but from the mother who decided which child got to belong in the family portrait. People think the silent child grows up well-behaved. But I was not built to disappear. I turned silence into language. I taught myself how to draw my face back into the frame. And this chapter, the first one I'm finally telling, is not a complaint. It's a declaration. You don't need an invitation to exist in the story that belongs to you. Family isn't who holds you by blood. It's who never makes you beg to be loved. A family tree is meant to confirm you belonged. But I grew up in a family book where my page had been quietly torn out. No scandal, no crime, no dramatic exile. Just forgotten, like a faded line no one bothered to rewrite. And you know what hurts the most? Spending your whole life trying to be good enough for a list that was never meant to include you. That is a betrayal not of love, but of your very right to exist. At 18, I boarded a train to New York with a full scholarship and a heart that still believed in fairness. I thought, if I work hard enough, they'll see me. They'll remember me. I was naive enough to think success could buy me a seat at the table I'd always been left standing beside. But what I didn't understand back then was this. Some people will refuse to remember you, no matter how brightly you shine. To my mother, I was an accessory, a side character, a faint limb not worth sketching into the family diagram. Meanwhile, Candace, who had never left Georgia, whose grades scraped by, was still the pride of the Johnsons at every social gathering. I used to believe family was the one place you didn't have to prove your worth. I was wrong. In my house, love had terms and conditions. And those terms were, be presentable, be manageable, be someone mom could brag about at brunch. And like all betrayal stories that cut the deepest, the betrayal didn't come from outsiders. It came from the place that was supposed to feel like home. When I returned for my first visit after a year away, there was a new family photo framed in the living room. Mom, Candace, and a space where I used to stand. I asked, "When was that photo taken?" Mom smiled casually. "Oh, our little anniversary shoot. You were busy with school, remember?" I didn't respond, but inside I knew this wasn't just a missed photo. It was a true infidelity story, not of romance, but of identity, of being erased. Candace had just started dating Julian, a wealthy tech guy from D.C., and my mother lit up like royalty being restored to her throne. Every meal revolved around wedding talk, designer gowns, the perfect husband. I offered, "I could help design the invitations if you want." Candace smiled politely. "Sure, I'll think about it. You're the design one, right?" But I knew that smile. It wasn't an invitation. It was a rearview mirror reflecting a past they'd already driven away from. That was the moment I realized I wasn't cut off like a clean break. I was removed piece by piece, with sidelong glances, events I wasn't invited to, and lines like, "You're probably too busy with school," used like dusters to gently wipe me out of the picture. So I started writing. Not for them. For me. I recorded every fragment, every conversation, every offhand remark like a survivor cataloging the aftermath of a family car crash. To remind myself, you didn't imagine it. You were there. You were dismissed. Resurrection never begins with light. It begins by naming the darkness. I shifted from trying to belong to building a space that belonged to me. A place where I didn't need permission to exist. I started my first art projects around chosen forgetting. Stories of children who had been deliberately left out of reunions, introductions, and the kind of infidelity stories that don't happen in marriages, but in families that fracture at their roots. You don't need to be in the family photo to know you were real. Not everyone who shares your blood shares your heartbeat. When they refuse to speak your name, don't whisper back. Speak louder, as proof that you exist, with or without their approval. I once believed that if I was good enough, kind enough, dedicated enough, I'd earn a seat at the table of family love. But the truth is, some tables are set with your absence in mind. Some stages you're asked to build, only to be shoved backstage when the curtains rise. The pain isn't in the absence of an invitation. It's in being the one who designed it all, from the backdrop to the belief, and still being told you don't belong. Candace announced her engagement on a March afternoon through an Instagram photo soaked in candles, a diamond-ringed hand, and the caption, "Soon to be Mrs. Julian." Beneath it were hundreds of congratulatory comments, mostly from my mother's friends, who'd long declared Candace the beacon of our model black family. I wasn't tagged. No one mentioned me. But I hit like, not because I was happy, but because pretending had become muscle memory. I messaged her, "If you need help designing the wedding, I'd love to. I have some really elegant backdrop ideas." Candace replied 3 days later, "Thanks, I'll talk to Mom and Julian. Don't want to burden you while you're busy in New York." I wasn't a burden. I was the one who had stayed up countless nights sketching layouts for events where people couldn't even remember my name. I was the ghost behind dazzling invitations, the praised logos, the parties where I was called the bride's sister. Never Savannah, the daughter who once lived here. I started drafting wedding ideas, not because they asked, but because part of me still hoped I'd be seen. Each line I drew was a quiet plea. Maybe this time they'll remember me. I imagined Candace in white, standing beneath an arch I designed. I imagined my mother smiling proudly and saying, "My daughter created that." Then the invitations were sent out. My name wasn't on the list. It wasn't an oversight. It was intentional. The wedding website read, "Daughter of Mrs. Yvonne Johnson, Candace, will wed Julian Tate." I stared at that line like someone reading her own erased birth certificate. I didn't cry. I stood still, as if silence would help me vanish completely. I drove to Georgia on the wedding day, wore a dark dress, carried the plastic-sealed design, prints like proof of my existence. At the chapel gate, a security guard stopped me. "You're not on the list." "Sorry, ma'am." I called my mother. She came outside, adjusted her dress, and said quietly, "Today is a celebration. We don't need drama." I laughed, a laugh sharp like glass. Then from now on, I'll live exactly like the outsider you've always seen me as. I turned around, left nothing behind but the designs. No blessings, no anger. I was done being a pawn in their perfect family chessboard. And in that moment, I learned more than any art school ever taught me. Not everyone who shares your blood knows how to show respect. Not everyone who held you as a baby will lift you when you rise. Sometimes, cheating doesn't happen in romance. It lives in stories cheating trust, eroding the foundations of belief and recognition. Not everyone you help build castles will hand you the keys. Some tables were never meant for you, not because you weren't enough, but because they never planned to make room. Being the designer doesn't mean you have to settle for being the background. There are parties with long tables, golden lights, and the sound of clinking glasses, yet no seat reserved for you. Not because there weren't enough chairs, but because they had already decided who gets to sit and who must stand. And when you realize you're not a guest, but just the forgotten kitchen hand, that is when you learn. Forgiveness doesn't begin with a hug. It begins with the courage to walk away and create a celebration of your own. Candace's wedding passed like a beautiful movie for someone else. Local news ran a feature on Georgia's most inspiring couple. My mother smiled radiantly in every photo. I smiled too, but no one saw it because I wasn't in any of the pictures. A week later, my mother hosted a thank you party at our family home, a gathering of relatives and close friends to celebrate the big day. I wasn't invited, but an aunt from Florida, unaware of the situation, accidentally forwarded me a soft, gold-trimmed card. For those who helped make it happen, I laughed. A cold, metallic laugh that cut like steel. I had made it happen. With ideas, with loyalty, with showing up even when they pretended I wasn't there. And now I wasn't invited to the very event that honored those who contributed. This wasn't just neglect. It was an infidelity story on a deeper level, where your loyalty is betrayed by those who share your last name. I drove back to the old house, parked on the side of the road, watched through the window as light spilled out. Inside were jazz tunes, the clinking of glasses, and Candace narrating her honeymoon in Italy. I felt like a lost traveler with no map, but I no longer wanted to find a way back. What rose in me wasn't bitterness. It was human revenge, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that shines. I wouldn't crash their party. I would create another where I was the host and all the forgotten daughters had a seat at the table. That night, I returned to my tiny Brooklyn apartment, opened my laptop, and began drafting an art project titled The Party with No Seat, a series of illustrations and poems about those who are erased, ignored, or dimmed within their own families. I submitted the concept to a small gallery. A week later, they confirmed the exhibit. I didn't call my mother, didn't send an invite, Not out of spite, but because I'd stopped expecting them to show up. At the opening night, an older woman paused at one piece, a painting of a girl standing next to a dinner table with no chair. She touched the canvas and whispered, "I've never seen myself in a painting before. Now I do." I smiled. For the first time in years, I didn't need to prove anything. I just needed to create. I once lived in a room without a mirror, not because I was poor, but because I didn't want to see myself. When you grow up inside family tales that have been edited and airbrushed, your face becomes something others paint over. Without mirrors, I didn't have to face my own eyes, the eyes that once begged to be seen. But when you've rebuilt your life, nothing is more terrifying or more powerful than looking straight into your reflection and saying, "I'm still here." I lived in a small room in Brooklyn, a room bright enough to keep a cactus alive, quiet enough to hear my heartbeat at midnight. But one thing was never present, a mirror. I didn't hate mirrors. I used to love them when I was a little girl wrapping a towel on my head, pretending I was a princess in the bathroom. But years passed. The whispers of my mother, of Candace, of relatives, each word carving itself into my face, made me stop looking. I started believing my face was something to hide, to edit, or worse, to forget. I didn't hang mirrors in my home because I didn't know who would look back. The erased daughter, the artist forever seeking permission, or the woman trying so hard to silence old wounds. Then one day, after an art show, a young woman approached me. "You're the one who painted the girl outside the dinner table, right?" "Yes," I said. That painting helped me look at myself again. I always felt like the one left out. She didn't know it, but her words were a mirror, the first I had dared to face in years. That night, I went home, opened my laptop, and started a new project. Faces Without Mirrors. I drew portraits of people erased by their families, people who lived through family betrayal and survived, not because anyone saved them, but because they saved themselves. In every stroke, I saw pieces of myself, and for the first time, I hung a small mirror on my wall. Not big, just enough to see my eyes. Enough to see I was still me, despite what anyone tried to paint over. No one can stop you from seeing yourself unless you hand them the mirror. Candace called 2 weeks later, not to apologize, but to say my mother was sick. I visited, not with anger, but with clarity. My mother looked at me with eyes that seemed lost, and I realized she, too, had once been a child without a mirror. She didn't teach me to see myself because she never dared look at her own reflection. I didn't say, "I forgive you." I just held her hand, long enough to let her know I no longer needed a role in the old play. I was writing a new script now, and this time I'm the lead. There are letters you don't write to get a response, but to release, like a wound that needs air to heal. When your heart has been left behind in family tales where your name is never mentioned, you don't write to blame. You write to close the chapter. And sometimes, hidden revenge isn't found in retaliation, but in your decision to end the story with a silence they never saw coming. I wrote the letter on a winter morning. No snow, just fog, like threads of gray tying knots around my thoughts. I sat at the kitchen table, light leaking through the window like blurred memories, and began to write to my mother. Not to blame her. I had moved past that. I wrote because I needed to let go, not win something back. Dear Mom, I'm not writing to ask questions. I'm not expecting answers. This is a letter to myself, the daughter you chose not to mention in the countless family tales told over the years. I know I was never the favorite. I wasn't soft. I wasn't obedient. I didn't fit the mold you painted. But I was still human and still your daughter. I paused, took a deep breath, and continued. I used to try so hard to be chosen, to be named, to be included in the pictures, the gatherings, the speeches. But I learned some seats were never meant for me, not because I wasn't worthy, but because they never planned to invite me. You taught me with silence, and now I answer with life, one that no longer needs your validation. I folded the letter unsealed. I placed it in a wooden box, alongside a few of my first sketches, notes from design school, and a journal where I once wrote, "If they don't see you, don't shrink. Grow louder." I didn't send it. I didn't need to. That was my hidden revenge, not burning the past, but rebuilding myself in a present they could no longer deny. I took the box to the park where I often sat and drew, and buried it beneath a ginkgo tree. Not like the dramatic revenge stories in movies, I didn't need witnesses. Peace doesn't need an audience. After that day, I started a free workshop called The Unnamed Ones, for people who'd been erased from tables, photographs, or family narratives. Each person got a blank sheet and was asked, "If you could write a letter you'll never send, what would you say?" Some cried, some laughed, some hands trembled, but everyone wrote. And in their writing, I saw myself. The cheating stories in families rarely get told. No one wants to believe blood can betray. But I tell them, not to accuse, but to free. There's a certain group of people who are always forgotten at every celebration, not because they're unworthy, but because they don't fit the invitation someone else already wrote. They are the uninvited, not once, but for years. Each time cuts like a silent blade. But these same people, by rising, by carving their own place, have turned exclusion into a quieter, sharper weapon than any trumpet in the betrayal stories life insists on telling. I met them on a Saturday afternoon at an old library. My very first workshop, The Unnamed Ones, drew just 5 attendees. But each one carried an entire hidden universe. A man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, shirt buttoned neat, stood and said, "I'm the father of 2 children, but at their weddings, I sat at the back table. No one introduced me. I felt like the neighbor who was invited out of obligation. A young woman, not even 20, wept as she whispered, 'I live with my grandmother. My mom's still alive, still lives in the city, but she's never called me her daughter. I'm the mistake in every family dinner.' I listened, and in every story I saw myself. I wasn't just leading the session. I was a living testimony to betrayal stories that didn't need knives to leave us bleeding for years. I wasn't present at my own sister's wedding, even though I designed every detail. I've sat outside family reunions like a stranger to my own blood. And like them, I once believed silence was the only way to not be hurt anymore. After that meeting, we created something new, a traveling exhibition titled The Uninvited. Each person submitted a story, a letter, a sketch, a voice memo, all born from hearts that never had a seat in the infidelity stories of their families, where betrayal wasn't romantic, it was deliberate omission. We carried the exhibit across eastern states, not flashy, not heavily funded, just honest. Just eyes seeing themselves named for the very first time. I remember Philadelphia. A middle-aged woman approached, trembling, and placed her hand on a painting of an empty chair at a dinner table. "I thought I was the only one never invited," she said. I held her hand and whispered, "You're not. This time, we have our own table." I no longer write for replies. I write to release. I tell stories so others don't feel alone. I build rooms because I've lived the cold of standing at closed doors. And if someone asks me, "Is this a true infidelity story?" I'll say yes, but not about lovers. It's about the deepest betrayal, when your own blood chooses to forget you exist. I don't retaliate. I rebuild. I don't wait for invitations. I build doors. And this time, I know I am not walking in alone. Love shouldn't begin with a cut. Not because both people are broken, but because they dared to heal before stepping forward. I believed someone who had been rejected would understand me. But not all wounds create empathy. Some only create complicity. When I learned to love without bleeding to be understood, I realized true love doesn't need scars as validation. I met Amir at an art talk in Boston. He stood at the back of the room, silent throughout, only approaching after everyone had left. "You paint the spaces people leave behind," he said. I nodded. "Because I've lived in them." He invited me for coffee. We sat in a small cafe, soft jazz in the background. He shared how his family cut ties when he, a finance student, chose fine art instead. I told him about my mother, about Candace, about a wedding I wasn't even invited to though I designed it. We didn't try to impress each other. We simply showed up. In the days after, we walked more than we met. No one rushed. There was a fragile yet enduring respect, like washi paper, impossible to tear with old questions like, "Have you forgiven them?" Or, "Are you still angry?" I used to date men who believed love was salvation. That if they arrived just right, I'd become the grateful woman who obediently gave her heart. But I didn't need saving. I had already saved myself. I don't want love to be a reward for enduring. An ex once told me, "We fit because we're both damaged." But that's the trap of many cheating wife stories. Two people holding onto each other with shared scars, never healing enough to move forward together. I've lived through stories cheating like that, beautiful at first, bitter in the end. With Amir, we don't love each other because we hurt the same. We love because we chose healing together. Once, when I panicked thinking I was being weak by leaning on him, Amir simply placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You're not leaning on me. You're just resting." Love, I realized, doesn't need to conquer. It isn't the prize after a true infidelity story, not the sweet ending after betrayal. It's simply a place where you can breathe, where you can be yourself, with no permission needed. I didn't tell my mother about Amir, not because I'm hiding, but because I don't need her approval anymore. And not because I'm hiding from Candace. This love isn't for show. It's for living. And for the first time, I didn't see myself as someone who's finally loved despite the pain. I saw myself as someone worthy of love, precisely because I had no wounds left to prove. One morning, you wake up and realize you no longer want to live in a house painted by someone else, with curtains they picked and scents they preferred. You want to open the windows, repaint the walls, hang curtains you sewed yourself, and burn a candle that actually smells like you. This isn't rebellion, it's a kind of human revenge, quietly reclaiming the corners of your life that others once occupied. I moved into my new apartment in early April. It's a small third-floor flat, old enough to have character, new enough that no one's marked it with their presence. I looked around, and there was no trace of Candace, no whisper of my mother, no echo of the family drama stories I'd escaped. No paint colors they chose. No mirror reflecting a face sculpted to fit their mold. I went to Home Depot and picked the fabric, earthy burnt orange. No one suggested it. No one protested. I brought it home and learned to sew curtains using YouTube videos. My stitches were shaky at first, but in the end, the seams were straight. The curtains aren't perfect, but they're mine. And when the afternoon sunlight filters through, the room glows honey-colored, gentle and steady, like the woman I'm becoming. Next, I chose a scented candle, bergamot with cedarwood. It smells like rebuilding. Not lavender, the scent my mother preferred. Not that cloying vanilla my sister insisted on at the holidays. For the first time in my life, my home smelled like me. When Amir came over, he didn't compliment it the way people usually do. He said, "This apartment has a voice." I smiled. It's my voice, finally uninterrupted. We shared dinner on the floor. I still haven't bought a table. And I realized I don't need all the pieces to feel whole. The next day, a distant aunt texted, "Your mother mentioned you moved out. Don't be angry with her, she's old." I didn't reply. I'm no longer the girl desperate for validation from people who turned me into the backdrop of their family revenge stories. I unpacked each item, each object a silent statement. And that meticulously saved wedding invitation from Candace, I didn't burn it. I wrapped it, slipped it into a box labeled, "Proof that I was invited, but not welcomed." Then I tucked it deep in my closet, like an infidelity story that no longer pierces my heart, only reminds me I once loved enough to endure, and now I love myself enough to let it go. Rebuilding doesn't need fanfare. It demands consistency, each stitch, each painted wall, each small choice no one can veto anymore. That spring afternoon, I opened the window, and a breeze stirred the burnt orange curtains. In that moment, I knew I'd written a new chapter of my life. No longer a supporting character in someone else's story, I became the narrator in my own space. I don't need revenge served on nails and tears. I've claimed it in living out loud by simply existing with clarity and smelling exactly how I choose. I got the call at 2 a.m. There will come a day when the one who pushed you off the cliff calls from the same pit they fell into. Not to apologize, not to own their wrongs, but to ask you to save them. And in that moment, you'll understand that revenge isn't always about striking back. It's about showing up. Not to embrace, but to make it clear you've broken the cycle. That's burning revenge in silence. You got out while they're still stuck. Candace's voice. Hoarse. Cracked. Unlike her. "Savannah." I said nothing. "Mom's in the hospital." I threw on a coat and stepped into the night. Not because I wanted to, but because I knew I had to show up, not as the daughter they once exiled from their family tales, but as someone who had made it through. The hospital room was sterile white, the scent of antiseptic mixed with the familiar perfume my mother used to wear. It caught in my throat. Candace sat slumped in a chair, no signature lipstick, no cold stare that used to treat me like the smudge on their family portrait. "She asked for you," Candace whispered. She didn't say anyone else's name. I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollow. A space once desperate to be filled with love was now just quiet. I sat beside the bed. Mom opened her eyes, looked at me like I was a stranger wearing a familiar face. I held her hand, for the first time in 10 years. No words, just presence. Candace cried. I didn't. Not because I was cold, because I had already cried enough tears for them on nights no one asked how I was even surviving. I stayed until morning, not out of old notions of duty, but to stand as proof that I existed, that I was hurt, that I walked away from family betrayal and came back not to rebuild, but to reclaim my space on my own terms. Candace followed me to the parking lot. "Are you angry?" I smiled faintly. I'm too tired to be angry. I was wrong. But back then, I was just a kid trying to be loved. I nodded. I get that. But understanding doesn't mean I return. I didn't say more. I got into my car, closed the door, and watched Candace, small for the first time like I had once been. That was burning revenge. No sharp words, no weapons drawn, just standing tall, living well, and walking away without needing anyone's permission. They once erased me from their family tales. Now they speak my name in desperation. And I didn't turn them away, but I didn't go back either. I showed up to make one thing clear. I rewrote my own story, and it no longer revolves around them. I drove back to Brooklyn just as the sky turned light. No tears, no tremble, only one thing certain in my chest. Kindness is not weakness. It's living proof. I made it out of the fire and didn't have to burn anyone else to become strong. We grow up believing that blood means family, but sometimes the people who hurt you the most share your last name. And the ones who help you rise again are strangers with no shared DNA. Family is not found in chromosomes. It lives in the hands that don't let go when everything else falls apart. That's a form of hidden revenge, not by burning down the past, but by rebuilding a future with people who never betrayed you. I invited them over for dinner on a Friday night. Not the family I was born into, but the family I chose. Tina, the first friend who held me when I collapsed after my failed art show. Marcus, the one who helped me move into my new apartment without asking a single question about my past. And Miss Ellis, the 70-year-old neighbor who let me plant flowers in her yard just because she said, "A survivor deserves a spring." We sat around the dinner table. I painted myself. No blame. No comparisons. No one asked me to unpack family tales to justify my presence. I spoke because I wanted to, and they listened as if every scar in my story was a testimony of survival, not shame. I used to think family was something you couldn't choose, that cheating stories belonged only to romantic love, not bloodlines. But when those who share your name are the first to erase you from dinners, from photos, from their narrative, you learn to start again. I chose every person at that table with my heart, not with my genetics. When Tina raised her glass and said, "To Savannah, the woman who refused to let betrayal define her worth," I smiled, genuinely, without armor, without pretending. A friend once said to me, "You seem like you've forgiven them." I replied, "It's not forgiveness. It's refusing to let them shape the way I live anymore." That's hidden revenge. Not loud, not cruel, just so clear that when they return, there's no longer a place for them in your life. One time my mother texted, "Grandma's memorial is this Saturday. Everyone hopes you'll come." I drafted a reply, "Thank you. I have a small dinner planned with my family." Then I deleted it, not because I wanted to go back, but because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I didn't choose revenge through rage. I didn't need revenge stories full of drama. I responded through wholeness and quiet conversations by a warm stove where no one tried to reshape me to fit their frame. Family, I've learned, is not who birthed you. It's who doesn't leave when you stop trying to earn their love. And that's the most beautiful hidden revenge I've ever known. No shared blood, just real care. No shared history, just a future we choose together. I left my mother's house on a Sunday morning. Not everyone leaves out of anger. Some walk away because they finally realize they deserve peace that doesn't ask for permission. When you stop arguing to be understood, stop waiting to be seen, it's not surrender. It's self-respect. That's when you learn that some betrayal stories don't end in confrontation, but in a quiet, firm departure, because you've finally chosen yourself without needing an audience. No yelling, no slamming doors, just a small suitcase and a spirit that no longer strained to be loved. No one told me to go, but no one asked me to stay either. And that was the clearest sign of all. I once believed that if I tried hard enough, if I forgave often enough, I would eventually be seen as someone who mattered. But I've read too many infidelity stories to know this truth. Not all betrayals are romantic. Sometimes, the deepest betrayals were the face of family, using love as the excuse to keep you trapped in pain. Candace texted me that evening, "You're leaving again, just when things were starting to calm down." I read it. Then I put the phone down. I wasn't leaving. I was finally staying with myself. Amir helped me move into the new apartment. He didn't ask why I was crying in the middle of the night. He just handed me a cup of tea and said, "You don't need a reason to leave. You only need a reason to stay. And if you don't have one, leaving is the right choice." I used to think that if I endured long enough, I'd be rewarded. But a true infidelity story doesn't always have a neat ending. Some betrayals aren't about cheating, they're about the silence that comes when you most need protection. And I've lived through those betrayal stories completely. I started rewriting my life, not with a 5-step success plan, but with small, deliberate acts. Buying flowers for myself, eating breakfast on time, responding to people who made me feel valuable, refusing to let the fear of loneliness drive me back to those who made me feel like an afterthought. I didn't need anyone's forgiveness for leaving. I didn't leave to hurt anyone. I left because I had been hurting for too long. A friend once asked me, "What if they change?" I smiled. I didn't leave because they were wrong. I left because I'm worth more than waiting for them to be right. I know some people will retell my story through warped betrayal stories. She was too sensitive. She just couldn't sacrifice enough. But I'm not here to fit the version of me they invented. I'm here to live as the version I choose, whole, awake, and unapologetic. And that is the only ending I need. I'm no longer the victim in other people's infidelity stories. I'm the author, and I'm writing my next chapter, not out of anger, but because I'm worth a life that's peaceful, honest, and drenched in sunlight.